Welcome everyone to our second Education Rank and File Safety Committee meeting. My name is Tanya Kent. I am a member of the Socialist Equality Party and a special needs teacher, and I'll be moderating the meeting this afternoon. I'm very pleased to see that we have people registered and participating in many parts of the world this afternoon, including the United States, France, Spain, Germany, Australia, as well as many parts of the United Kingdom. I think this contests the global character of the issues that confront educators the world over, and this is also expressed on the panel of speakers and contributions today. We will have contributions from the United States, France and Spain, and we took contributions at our last meeting from the US, Australia, Germany and Italy. The aim of this meeting today is very specific. It is to call on educators, students and parents to join the Educators Rank and File Safety Committee, which we have launched, and to build it in your workplace, school, college, campus and communities. Now, the dangers that confront educators and the working class are more than pregnant in the situation. There is no solution to this crisis within the present political setup. The opposition that does exist will be guided through the actions and decisions of participants in this room, in collaboration with the independent rank and file safety committees that are being set up internationally by the International Committee of the Fourth International, and nowhere else. And that is the task before us. It is some 8 months now since the COVID pandemic has swept the world. Every government and institution of every variety and coloration has proven completely incompetent and bankrupt in its response. Its sole interest has been the preservation of the wealth of the elites, which they represent, who have benefited to the tune of trillions globally at the expense of the lives and well-being of the mass of society. The death rate is fast approaching 1 million, with 952,000 dead globally officially, and many hundreds of thousands of deaths to come as country after country witnesses a massive resurgence of infections. We must act independently. Waiting or hoping that governments might be forced into another lockdown or take stock of the situation and act to prevent more deaths and destruction is futile. The ruling elites have opted for the policy of herd immunity. At the last meeting that we held, The working class must respond to this situation with a program of class struggle. The role of educators is key in this. They are at the center stage in this pandemic, as the back to work agenda is inconceivable outside of keeping schools open. The parents of children must be forced to continue pumping profits. If teachers, children and their families die in the process or get seriously ill, so be it. And this is happening at a rapid pace, as we warned. When we last met exactly 2 weeks ago, I noted that the vast majority of schools have reopened or will do so in the next few days and weeks across England and Wales. And I said, although there is much confusion and some have bought into the lies that have been spun, this will change, and quite rapidly at that. There is something terrible unfolding. The situation will shift, the confusion will turn into anger, and the committee that is being formed today will guide that anger into a consciously formulated and organised political opposition, and of this we are fully confident. So where do we stand 2 weeks later? Well, at that meeting, I noted there were 8 schools in England which reported COVID infections since opening on September the 1st. By last Thursday evening, 1,118 schools had been hit by the coronavirus infections, forcing many to close and partially or fully shut. This number is rising rapidly. There were 25,000 teachers in England who have been forced out of the classroom and into self-isolation amidst a national shortage of COVID-19 tests due to the inability to process them by the government. The world's beating test and track system, which we were promised, has collapsed in just 2 short weeks, unable to cope with the level of demand which the government knew would happen. The response has not been to improve the system, but to impose rationing for testing, with the Education Minister Gavin Williamson telling people not to get tested if they don't have any of the 3 symptoms listed, even if they have been in contact with anyone with COVID. That 36% of adults are asymptomatic and children are even more so will produce an inevitable spike of infections without robust testing systems. The infection rate stands at 7,000 daily, and independent SAGE estimate that there are some 38,000 infections daily. In the absence of the testing of the virus, it has been allowed to rip wild through communities. The testing catastrophe has placed massive strains on teaching staff and managers. New research from the School Leaders Union, the National Association of Head Teachers, revealed that 4 in 5 schools have children not attending because they can't get a test. That is 80% of schools. And that almost 50% of schools have staff off because they cannot get a test. The mental health of teachers attempting to manage the impossible has been revealed in a survey from Education Support, where more than half of teachers say their mental health has declined during the COVID-19 pandemic, with the lack of timely government guidance cited as their biggest challenge. In addition to this, some 48% of senior managers, head teachers and deputy heads have reported a decline in their mental health, along with 48% of other educational professionals such as teaching assistants. The findings suggest that the mental health of those working in education has suffered more than those of any other profession. It found that 27.3% of those surveyed reported a level of mental distress that is potentially clinically significant. Just as an example of the many thousands of comments by teachers that have been left on social media, the Boycott the Return to Unsafe Schools website produced a comment by one, Salma, who said, my anxiety has hit the roof. I dread getting up in the morning and going to school. I have never felt like this before. It's horrible. I really don't want to quit. I really do want to quit, but can't afford to do so. I feel so trapped. I loved my job, but not anymore. I never wanted a job that meant putting my life and my family's life on the line. And she expresses the sentiments of many thousands. Around 12% of school pupils, that's over 1 million children, have not returned since the full reopening of schools. The majority of these are families who have no confidence in the government's claim that schools are the safest place the children can be, and they now face the imposition of massive fines. There are some 10 million workers across the United Kingdom in local lockdowns across towns and cities, with another 3 million to be added to the list from Monday onwards. In opposition to a national lockdown being proposed instead of half-hearted national circuit break measures that would be in operation for just only 2 weeks, the government is refused to accept a national lockdown and has said that it will not, under any circumstances, any lockdowns will not involve schools, and workplaces must stay open. It will only be pubs and restaurants that have opening hours restricted. The government has insisted that any measures that are taken, like I said, will not include schools. And I think this is very clearly a political decision. The only thing that they have offered under pressure is to extend the half term for 1 week in the end of October. And this will be too late. The reopening of schools has been at the core of the government's agenda to attempt to kickstart the economy. And I think it's quite clear, therefore, that the response that must be adopted by the working class and educators must also be a political one. The situation we confront today is just the tip of the iceberg. Universities will open to 1 million students under conditions with the largest infection rates in the 27 to 23-year-old age group, with very little protection and in crowded dormitories and lecture halls from Monday onwards. The reopening of schools has fueled this situation, as we and scientists have warned would happen. Europe has already seen over 228,000 COVID-19 deaths and 5 million cases, according to WHO. And most of those were during the peak from March onwards. However, scientists have warned that the premature ending of the lockdowns is producing an explosion and resurgence of the virus, and this will be covered in the meeting today. Now, the necessity for immediate intervention is before us. We have outlined a series of demands that can protect the safety and well-being of educators and the communities in which they live. The essential demand that must be advanced in this situation, however, is for the immediate closure of all schools and their reopening only when it is safe to do so. The virus is out of control, and outside of the complete closure of all schools and universities and the turn to online learning, which must be fully funded, there is no way out of this deadly situation. Walkouts and strikes must be called in all schools, leading to the fight for a general strike across the United Kingdom. This demand will not take place through the trade unions. Their position and role has been very clear throughout this pandemic. They fully support the reopening of schools and are opposed to any class militant action. So therefore, this action can only be led through an independent struggle of those here and fighting to broaden this campaign to as many schools, campuses that we can pursue. So I appeal to you all to participate in this fight, to participate in the discussion today, to explain what is happening in your workplace, the discussions that are taking place, raise your questions, and we can then begin this fight. I will introduce another speaker before we open the discussion, but in order to participate, you will see on your right-hand panel hands up symbol. So you need to click that if you want to discuss, or you could put a chat on the chat section. You can do that as people are speaking so that we can build up a list so that when discussion starts, we can immediately discuss these issues, and we call on people to keep their comments brief so that we can have as broad a participation as possible. And I would like to specifically urge and call on educators in particular to participate in this. So before we open this discussion, we would just like to bring one other contribution forward. I would like to introduce to you our next speaker, Evan Blake. Evan Blake is a member of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States and a coordinator of the Educators Rank and File Safety Committee. And the US, as everyone knows, is the epicenter of this pandemic. There are some 500,000 children who have been infected with COVID in the US. Thus far, 9 teachers have died in the space of 4 weeks, one as young as 28, as a consequence of the reopening of schools. Evan will outline the situation in the US, the work of the rank and file safety committees, which have been established in 4 major cities so far, and the growing resistance to the homicidal policies of the Trump government. Welcome, Evan, to the floor is yours. If you just unmute, please. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tanya. All right, one second. Hi everyone. Thank you, Tanya, for those opening remarks and for inviting me to speak at your meeting. I think that the development of this committee is really critical, alongside the formation of the London Bus Drivers Rank and File Safety Committee, the formation of networks of similar committees in every section of the working class. I think is really crucial to organizing the immense opposition to the homicidal policies of the Johnson administration. So as Tanya said, my report will focus on the political situation in the US and our work in building a network of educators rank and file safety committees across the country, which the SEP has really helped to organize in order to oppose these homicidal policies of reopening schools. These images on the screen are from a series of online meetings that we've held each Saturday over the past month, which have been well attended by educators and workers from the majority of states across the US, as well as international participants. As Tanya said, so far we've formed committees in 4 states, or cities or states. So we formed committees in New York City, Detroit, Florida, and Texas. And we have plans to announce similar committees in Los Angeles, San Diego, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Hawaii, and in other states. And we're also working, our party, the SEP, is also working to organize, we've built a network of similar committees among auto workers throughout the Midwest. And we're reaching out to Amazon workers, meat packers, healthcare workers, and other sections of the working class. Can you go to the next slide, please, Richard? So as Tanya said, there have already, as a result of the reopening of schools, there have already been a number of teachers that have passed away. And these images are five of those teachers that have died since the reopening of schools began in July. And really, underscores the human toll of the ruling class's policies. Each of these teachers was beloved by their students and in their communities. Demetria Bannister, in the bottom right, was only 28 years old. She taught third grade in South Carolina. And Ashley DeMarinis, in the top right, was only 34, and she taught special education. And both of them passed away earlier this month. And at this point, millions of students and tens of thousands of educators across the US have been sent back to schools for some form of in-person instruction, whether that's fully in-person 5 days a week, or what they call the hybrid model, where essentially they have half the students each day, but every student comes to campus throughout the week, which is really equally unsafe. And so in addition to this, there's also been a widespread reopening of college campuses, and there's been a huge upsurge in COVID infections wherever college campuses have reopened. There were, and also K through 12 schools. And at the beginning of July, there were news reports of hundreds of infections taking place throughout school districts across the country. And this made national headlines and forced many schools to close. And so in response, districts and states essentially moved to begin covering up future outbreaks and really creating regimes of censorship while punishing teachers and students that spoke out against school reopenings. And there's no organization that's keeping accurate records of the number of outbreaks tied to K through 12 schools reopening, but the CDC and other organizations report that infection rates have really skyrocketed among youth across the country. And in addition to the 5 teachers on this slide, at least 21 other educators have already died since schools began reopening. Can you go to the next slide, please, Richard? So the drive to reopen schools across the US escalated in early July. It's been spearheaded by the Trump administration, but really fully supported by the Democrats and Republicans at every level. And fundamentally, this campaign is motivated by the need to ensure the steady flow of profits to the financial oligarchy, and as Tanya said, to facilitate the development of herd immunity within the population, which is really a pseudoscientific theory that's completely unfounded. But essentially they argue that through mass infections, infecting upwards of 70% of the population, that this will essentially prevent the future spread of the virus. But there's it's been demonstrated that people can become infected multiple times, and really this policy is predicated on mass deaths, millions of people dying, and there's been really high rates of absenteeism among auto workers and broad sections of the working class because schools closed down in mid-March and in April and since then. And so really one of the key aims of the reopening of school is to force the 50 million children in the US back into school so that they can force their parents back to work. And it's in workers that we've spoken with, and there's been many reports in the media that really the conditions that workers face when they go back are even more exploitative than before the pandemic. And I think just to briefly review, another sort of a key component of this policy of herd immunity is the ruling class is really consciously and brutally seeking to kill off the older and most vulnerable sections of society, so that money earmarked for their pension funds, for healthcare, for Social Security, can now instead be handed over to the rich. And I think this reality was really underscored by the recent release of tapes and interviews by the Washington Post reporter Bob Woodward with U.S. President Donald Trump. And the interviews really make clear that Trump was fully aware in January of the massive dangers that were posed by the coronavirus, and he deliberately lied to the public about these dangers in order to put in place policies which have now killed over 200,000 people and infected nearly 7 million in the US alone. And most of the media coverage has sought to place the blame for this catastrophe solely on Trump. But in reality, this was a conspiracy by the entire political establishment, the corporate media, and really, just the highest levels of the state against the working class. The briefings that Trump was given in January were also given at a closed-door meeting that was open to all U.S. senators, which was held on January 24th. And in the following days, multiple senators, including Dianne Feinstein, Richard Burr, Kelly Loeffler, and others, proceeded to dump millions of dollars worth of stocks in anticipation of the markets collapsing. And Bob Woodward undoubtedly discussed his interviews with Trump on the with the Washington Post editorial board, and they said nothing publicly for 7 months. And during this time, in January and February, this really critical period, the virus was silently spreading throughout the population, while leading figures in the Democratic Party, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, Feinstein, all of them, they were saying nothing publicly about the dangers really until the end of February. And in the Woodward tapes, Trump said that his primary concern during this time was not to cause a panic. And by this, he meant a collapse in the stock markets and a growth of opposition within the working class. Can you go to the next slide, please? And so during this time, throughout February and March, the Democrats and Republicans worked to prepare the CARES Act, which was passed nearly unanimously at the end of March, and in order to bail out the banks and funnel trillions of dollars to the financial oligarchy. And as a result, the richest 400 individuals in the US, or 0.00012% of the population, now possess a record $3.2 trillion, which is $240 billion more than a year ago. Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos now has over $200 billion, while Tesla CEO Elon Musk has amassed over $100 billion. And following this, the passage of the CARES Act, throughout April and May, both parties conspired to implement the Return to Work campaign, with Trump and the Republicans spearheading this drive, the Democrats implementing essentially the same policies while promoting this narrative that they were, or really false narrative, that they were going to adhere to safety standards and protect workers. Can you go to the next slide, please? So the situation in the U.S. is incredibly explosive, and I think Trump's inciting of fascistic violence is very much connected to these policies that they've been implementing. They're really seeking to throw the working class back decades, and in order to do so, they have to implement police state forms of rule. And the entire ruling class is highly conscious of the radicalization that's taking place within the American working class, which is deepening each day. Just in terms of education, in the past 3 months, there have been hundreds of protests by teachers, students, and parents across the country. There's now over 100 Facebook groups that have formed in nearly every state to oppose the reopening of schools. Many of them have tens of thousands of members. and where schools have reopened, there's growing support for strike action in order to force them to close again. But really the chief obstacle that's preventing strikes from taking place, from really developing nationwide opposition, is the teachers' unions. Same, as is the case in the UK. In the US, the main unions are the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association, which oversee state and local teachers unions. And both the AFT and the NEA have refused to mobilize their millions of members in any form of nationwide protest or strike, and they're deliberately keeping districts isolated from one another. And over the past 2 weeks, there was a powerful strike by graduate students at the University of Michigan to oppose the unsafe reopening of their campus. And the grad student union is affiliated with the AFT, but AFT President Randy Weingarten essentially kept radio silence throughout the strike. Weingarten is a multimillionaire who sits on the Democratic National Committee, and instead of supporting the strike, she sent in the Michigan AFT president, David Hecker, who worked really, within 24 hours to shut down the strike this past Wednesday. Can you go to the next slide, please? In addition to this, really enormous betrayal, it was a very powerful strike that had wide support on college campuses and within the working class across the country. In addition to facilitating this betrayal, the unions have also promoted illusions in the bourgeois legal system in many states, promoting these really fraudulent lawsuits in Florida, Texas, Iowa, and Hawaii, while essentially allowing the schools to reopen, and preventing any form of strike action. And above all, the unions really work to subordinate teachers to the Democratic Party, which is equally beholden to Wall Street and the military. New York's Democratic politicians are pushing for the full reopening of schools. This image shows New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio with the president of the United Federation of Teachers, Michael Mulgrew. These two have been, conspiring in recent weeks to try to reopen the largest school district in the U.S., which is really meant to set a precedent across the country. And Democratic governors across the U.S. are promoting the same policies, including Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, Gavin Newsom in California, David Ige in Hawaii, and really informing our network of rank and file safety committees. We stand fully independent of the Democratic and Republican parties and the teachers unions. We're fighting to connect our struggle with the fight to close colleges and universities and with the broader working class in order to halt all non-essential production, to stop the spread of the pandemic, and to save lives. And we're also fighting to orient American workers towards the international class struggle and connect our struggles with those of educators and workers in the UK, Germany, France, Britain, Canada, Australia, and Brazil. And in closing, I want to reiterate Tanya's point that really, the pandemic has completely exposed the bankruptcy of world capitalism, the criminality and recklessness of the ruling classes in every country. I think there's, an enormous radicalization taking place in the working class, and really we're on the verge of massive social struggles all over the world. But the key element that's missing is revolutionary leadership and the organizational forms through which the working class can fight for its interests on a global scale. And I think the formation of networks of independent rank and file committees in every industry and in every country is a critical step in resolving this crisis. So I urge everyone on this call to get involved, to follow developments closely on the WSWS, and help build these committees as widely as possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evan, for that very important and significant contribution. And I think the points you raised about the formation of the committees and the extension in the United States under conditions where there is a real opposition developing is so critical. And I'm sure that many people will be interested in more information on this and wanting to ask questions. This is your opportunity now to ask questions, to add your name to the list, to raise your hand, as well as to put some remarks in the chat. We have a couple of questions already. We have Kevin Russ has a question, and I believe if you want, do you want to say your question? If you do, we'll find you and you can just unmute yourself and ask the question, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Tanya, for the start of the meeting. Yeah, I'll come on to a question. I'll try and keep this brief, but I just wanted to share a quick example, and hopefully it'll be of some use and interest. I'm a speaker as a former teacher and a current parent of 2 school-aged children, one who's just gone into year 7 to the start of secondary school. We've, like many families around the world, we've been horrified at the drive to return children into a setting that isn't safe. You know, we've heard Orwellian terms about bubbles that don't give us any kind of reassurance. And like many others, we've been asking lots of questions. This week, myself and my wife spoke to the Department for Education, Local Education Authority, and the local health protection team, as well as both schools that our children are meant to attend. And there's just been an absolute passing of the buck and a lack of clarity, I think deliberate lack of clarity, so that the blame can be placed onto students, onto teachers, and onto educational staff when things do go wrong. In particular, I've just got one quick statement to read to the question, will school inform me if there's a suspected case in my child's class? And we ask this question because of the lack of testing. Again, we think a deliberate lack of testing at the minute. And we've been told, in line with other schools within the trust and guidance from our local educational authority, we will not be informing parents of suspected cases in their child's bubble or in school generally. They then point to the fact that giving this type of information can cause anxiety within families, and that's unnecessary. As a former educator and teacher myself, you know, it's a complete about turn into the teacher I went into education to educate, to give impart information, and give education. You know, and this, we're now hearing a promotion of ignorance and keeping parents in the dark, and a complete lack of, well, we are safeguarding policies in schools, and it was certainly something that's in complete contradiction to any kind of safeguarding that I used to promote. And then to the point, I think, Tanya, that you made before, you know, I've got friends who still work in teaching, and one of the unions sent out a memo, an email with a slogan of "We stand behind you." And these teachers and educators are completely left completely unsupported by the unions. And then my final point would be, we feel sometimes as concerned parents that we're just operating in our own bubble on our own, and of course the World Socialist website gives us some comfort when we read the news on there, but it just absolutely hammers home for me this. It's absolutely crucial that there's an organised response to the crisis that we all face. I think that's necessary. So just wanted to share that with people. Hopefully that's, I didn't ramble on for too long there.
Thank you very much, Russ, for your comments. And, you know, again, you raise a number of important points, and I think in particular the issue of the necessity to unify parents who have been very isolated throughout this process, because they are parents and they're not part of any sort of organisation, and there is a tremendous lack of information. You're correct. The policy is that you do not inform parents of any suspected COVID cases, and even teachers in the workplace are not informed of any colleagues or children with suspected cases. You only know by accident or through rumour because somebody's not shown up. So that is quite common, and there are many instances even where people aren't necessarily informed of of an infection. If the school feels that they can manage it without necessarily closing a bubble and so on. And there is a conscious policy to keep the information within a very small, narrow leadership base. I mean, I know at my school, we were told categorically on Tuesday when we met that everything must go through senior management. No one is to discuss any suspected existing cases of COVID because they know what the latest guidelines is, which change every day. There is to be no discussion with parents. All communication is through senior leadership. And this has been repeated in school after school. When you look at some of the chats, people are just saying, you know, teachers have been told not to discuss with parents and so forth. And it isn't about panic. That's not their concern. It's about education, and it's about a joint campaign amongst teachers and so on to understand really what the real situation is. You know, we had that discussion on Tuesday, and no sooner had we got home, there was an infection, and we've had to self-isolate some of the classes and children and so on. So it spreads astronomically. So I think, you know, you are correct. I mean, and parents are really, particularly those who are far more conscious and aware of what's taking place and the real risks with this pandemic, they are being silenced. And it's important that their voices are heard, and that this becomes a unified perspective as well with teachers, because what you may think is happening in the school or what the attitudes of the staff are will be quite different to what they actually are. And so I think, you know, the committee does most definitely call upon parents to participate in this, because parents do confront the question of fining, which will begin in the next few weeks, because as I understand it, there's been a month for parents to decide, and if they're not returning in the next days or so, the fines will begin. So this is a key issue, and, you know, and this has to be a unified campaign. And as you say, the unions have refused to mobilise any opposition, protect their staff against any of the conditions that I've raised. Tom will be speaking on the unions quite soon to elaborate on what the response has been, but it is striking, and it's striking for staff as well. Absolutely nothing in this context, you know, in response to the thousands of teachers who are waiting for tests, the massive increase in the infection rate. Their position is still to keep schools open. So any opposition that develops will be in a direct conflict with them. We also had, if I can just find the questions. There was a comment by a person from France. I can't find it now. Sorry, hang on. I'll just get back onto where it was. Mermat Caramol, yeah, and which we have passed that on to Alex in France, because it is specifically about the situation in France, and Alex is aware of that question. I don't know if you wanted to speak to that question or make any points. If so, you're welcome to do so, and Alex can answer the points you raise shortly. Did you want to say anything, Mermat?
No?
No, okay, so, yeah.
No. Hello?
Sorry. Hello, yes?
Yeah, my question is about the Stylo Rouge in France, organization that updates lists of schools that have infections, and they have some sort of program for some sort of action, but it's quite vague. I'm not sure whether they are serious about action. I'm very concerned because I'm just very concerned. So I wonder if something like that could be set up in this country and in other countries in Europe. Yeah, so that's all I need. Something like this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question. Like I said, I'm not familiar with the organisation you're talking about, and I'm sure Alex will be able to comment on that. Can we please see if there are any others who want to participate at this point, please, especially educators, teachers who are on this forum today. We know there are some teachers. If you would like to contribute on what the situation is, what you think the issues are, that would be really, really helpful. We do have a few written questions which we can take shortly, but we would really appreciate any contributions from the floor. So please raise your hand or contribute in the chat box. Are there any others who really want to participate at this point in time? It'd be very important if you could. On my screen, I can't yet. I mean, we can take a few of the questions, and perhaps if the people are here and want to ask, they can do. I'm just trying to see if I can actually get the name of the person who's asked it. So we've got that question. There's a question. I can't see who's. Why are schools not sending whole bubbles home? What was the point of a bubble? How can they ensure adequate ventilation in rooms when there are no windows? I don't know if that's still Kevin. More than two inches, if at all. How can you say no more than 6, but instead classes of children in 30? There's another question. COVID-19 spreads in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces with no social distancing and little use of masks. How can the UK government continue with their messaging that schools and colleges and universities are safe when they know they are not? That's by James. I don't know if James is there and wants to speak to that question. Yeah, I think the other question, sorry, was from Kate. If you are there, and who's a tutor and a parent, if you want to speak on those, you can. Otherwise, we can take those questions. Kate and James, if you want to elaborate, please do. Otherwise, I'll take that. I mean, in relationship to the bubbles, we had a whole discussion on it at the last meeting some 2 weeks ago, and we explained that the bubbles are just a fiction. They have no scientific basis whatsoever, because as the other question asks, how can you say that 6 people are safe, but in schools there's 30, or a bubble of 240? But the bubble is aimed at not preventing infections at all. It's about containing an infection in order to continue to keep the school open. And that's its entire purpose. And in some schools, they are sending a bubble home, but there have been many instances in which some schools are sending the children who sat on either side of the child who was infected, and that is it. This notion that children haven't mixed in the meantime outside of those who they've sat next to is just ludicrous. So there was no point in the bubble other than to, one, pretend that there's some sort of safety measures, and two, as a mechanism to contain the infection and not prevent it. And you can see by the implosion of infections in schools that this is not working. And in fact, anyone who's worked in a school, I'm pretty confident it's not just our experience. Virtually every bubble, which began at the beginning of the year saying these are the safest way to protect children, stay in your bubble, don't mix your bubble, don't do this, that and the other. As people were being forced to self-isolate, the bubbles collapsed. They've just collapsed because there's not sufficient staff to ensure that that bubble continues safely. So they've had to bring in other staff who have never been part of that bubble to continue the teaching. So bubbles are being changed all the time. And as we said, the bubble's broken before you even enter the classroom. Through the school bus, transport, parents and so on who are outside. It's just a pure fiction to cover for the fact that there are no protective measures. And ventilation is a huge issue because it is linked to the way that the virus is spreading, and many schools do have poor ventilation. And there's been, and that's been known throughout the whole 6 months that that we've been in lockdown. It's been known that the schools are in a very poor state in terms of welcoming children back safely, whether it be social distancing, ventilation, and they're not invested any money in this. I mean, in my school, for example, we share one bathroom between 2 classes, 2 completely separate bubbles, 1 bed, no ventilation. And if anything's going to spread anywhere, it's going to be in that environment. So this is repeated over and over again, and they don't really care. They know all of this. They know what the situation in the schools. They've de-invested in it for decades. They're absolutely bankrupt, and that's what's taking place. And again, I think it's linked to the question that James has asked, you know, that it does spread in poor ventilated indoor spaces. I mean, the message at the beginning of the year began with school children are not vectors, etc. That message is changing. The government has been forced to accept that children are in fact vectors, and that this implosion of COVID has been triggered by the reopening of schools, but they've continued to keep them open, and at the same time agreed that 1 million university students should return to university from next Monday. They don't care, as we said, they don't care how many lives are lost. This agenda must be pursued. They cannot have any let up on the reboosting of the economy and the revamping of profits and so forth. And to the extent that there isn't an opposition, an organised opposition, all of this will continue, and people will recognise the hypocrisy and the double talk and all the rest of it. But until they begin to take action, independent of the Labour Party and the trade unions, then they will impose whatever they want. And that's the real significance of this discussion. So I'm just going to check if there are, because I'm on quite a few screens. Is there any other questions? You can type your question as well. I'll leave it a couple of minutes. We do have other speakers. You are welcome to participate at any point. Just continue to add your name, put your name to the list, and we'll take further questions. The next speaker will be, well, he's prepared a contribution which is recorded. His name's Miles Driver. He's a bus worker from London. He and his colleagues have set up a rank and file safety committee at a meeting of drivers in his garage at Cricklewood last Sunday. Over 33 transport workers have died from COVID thus far. The reopening of schools has led to a very direct impact on the risks that transport workers face. And this initiative has won a response across several other bus depots. And he is working at the moment and couldn't reorganise his shift, and has sent a recording to this meeting. And I know that there are other bus workers here on the significance of the step they have taken, and in solidarity with the struggle of educators. We're going to play that recording. You will need to put your microphones or your sound up to as high as you can, because it is a little bit difficult, because it's a recording on a phone that is sent. So hopefully you will be able to hear this very important message that is being sent. So if Richard, if you could place Miles Driver's contribution, play it now, thank you. Hi Tom, can you hear me? Is this happening?
The newly formed London Bus Workers Rank and File Safety Committee, I would like to express solidarity with your meeting today of teachers, parents and students opposing the unsafe return to schools. As London bus workers, we speak from experience about the deadly effects of COVID-19. Between March and May of this year, in little more than 12 weeks, 33 London bus workers, 29 of them drivers, were killed by the virus. These deaths were not inevitable. They were the outcome of the Tory government's refusal to impose a national lockdown until March the 23rd, more than 1 month after scientists warned such action was needed. But the Tory government had accomplices. Throughout February and March, as COVID spread across the UK, Labour Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, went on TV and told the public that London transport was safe and that PPE was not required, and that all they needed to do was wash their hands to the tune of Happy Birthday. Transport for London and bus companies claimed that there was a low risk of infection and no protection measures were taken. Documents obtained under the Freedom of Information Act show that Transport for London banned public safety announcements about COVID on bus, rail, and London Underground. They said they didn't want to panic passengers, as this would jeopardize operational efficiency. As for the union, they signed a tripartite agreement behind our backs with TfL and the bus operators, then issued a joint letter to drivers pledging industrial harmony and telling them that PPE was not required. Our lives count for nothing. Less than 3 months after being sent back to normal rosters, COVID-19 infection rates are once again on the rise. We now face a public health emergency. The connection between your struggle and that of bus and public transport workers cannot be more direct. Millions of students are being herded back into unsafe schools on unsafe public transport. Buses, like schools, are being transformed before our very eyes into breeding grounds for COVID-19. Photos this week on social media shows school children packed like sardines with zero social distancing. And in a memo sent by Metroline to bus drivers, it states that in accordance with Transport for London instructions, the government guidelines on social distancing do not, I repeat, do not apply to school children. The words do not are in bold and underlined because the memo is directed against bus drivers who believe first and foremost they must keep their passengers safe. In fact, with the reopening of schools, the previous passenger limits have been completely lifted, and this has been repeated in country after country. As bus drivers stated in our statement issued last week, quote, how many of these being crammed today into crowded buses and trains will end up tomorrow in hospital ventilators or in overflowing morgues, unquote. COVID-19 is already spreading among bus workers. At my garage, one driver and one apprentice engineer has been confirmed with COVID. An apprentice who is off work and self-isolating was only able to get a test through Bupa, which cost him £200. The bus companies, TfL and the union, in this case Unite, are once again engaged in a cover-up, seeking to block any knowledge of or struggle against these dangerous conditions. Last Sunday, we took the first step to establish the London Bus Drivers Rank and File Safety Committee. Our fight goes beyond bus garages. We face a determined enemies. The Johnson government's herd immunity strategy deliberately sacrifices lives to protect the profits of the super rich, and it is backed by Labour and the TUC, which are enforcing the return to work and the school reopening. But our allies are more powerful. We established the committee because we know the changes will only come about when the working class begins to act as one, in a struggle against the ruling class, its politicians, and the capitalist system for socialism. Our committee extends its solidarity to all those today at this meeting. We look forward to working closely with the Rank and File Educators Committee in the weeks and months ahead in a common struggle. Our fight is your fight. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Miles. I hope you could follow that really important contribution. I think Miles makes it very clear the connection between the issues confronting transport workers and students, teachers, etc., in relationship to how key transport is in the reopening of schools and getting people to work. And I think that step is very significant. And as he said, we need to work closely together in order to develop this initiative. I'd like to invite Alex Lantier to speak next. He's the National Secretary of the Parti de l'Égalité Socialiste. He will outline the situation in France, where there is a very large rise in infections, the opposition that is developing to this, and the work that's been conducted by the PES. Welcome, Alex, you have the floor. Unmute yourself, thanks.
Dear comrades and friends, I'm bringing greetings from the Parti de l'Égalité Socialiste in France to this very important meeting of the Education Forum, sponsored by the Socialist Equality Party in Britain. The call that you are launching to teachers and bus workers and other sections of workers to build their own independent workplace organizations is critical for workers, not only in Britain and in America, but worldwide. Across Europe, workers face malign indifference to COVID-19 by officials who are determined to force workers back to work and children back to school, no matter what the cost in lives. They are reopening schools fully aware that this accelerates the resurgence of COVID-19 caused by their premature ending of lockdowns this spring. In France, on August 31st, as schools were set to reopen, 3,082 new COVID-19 cases were detected. But yesterday, there were 13,215. Since schools have reopened, new cases have roughly doubled each week, and COVID emergency wards are already filling up in Bordeaux and in Marseille. Statisticians are warning that by October or November, French hospitals will again be overflowing with severe COVID-19 patients. On Thursday, the World Health Organization publicly warned of, quote, alarming rates of transmission, unquote, of COVID-19 in Europe, where 300,000 new cases were found last week. The WHO criticized European governments' relaxing of social distancing, saying, quote, if you lift the pressure from the virus, naturally, you're going to see this increase. The WHO explicitly criticized French and British officials' plans to cut the quarantine period for those exposed to COVID-19 from 14 to 7 or 10 days. The French government contemptuously ignored the WHO. It has eliminated social distancing requirements inside classrooms and dropped moves to ensure that children do not mix in hallways between classes. To avoid forcing children under 11 to wear masks is trampling on scientific studies and falsely claiming that children under 11 never spread the virus. This is simply not true. The French government is trying to hide the situation from teachers and parents. Yesterday, it adopted guidelines saying that teachers of children who test COVID positive should no longer be considered exposed to COVID-19. Thus, they do not need to be notified. The French government does not even provide statistics on the number of schools or classes shut down across France, though the Red Pens Teachers Facebook group has confirmed at least 1,200 institutions were affected as of last week. Yesterday, the French government also confirmed it would ignore WHO guidelines and reduce quarantine periods to 7 days. This means many infected people will emerge from quarantine too early and continue spreading the virus before they begin to experience symptoms. Anger is mounting among workers, with polls finding 62% disapproval of the French government's healthcare policies in the public. Anger is particularly explosive amongst the teachers. The Red Pens Facebook group announced yesterday There are plans by teachers to sue the French health and education ministers. They are accused of the following, and I quote, refusing to apply the principal measure against the pandemic, social distancing, and to close schools and classes for economic, ideological, and political reasons at the expense of our health. 2, turning education staff and students into guinea pigs for herd immunity policies, treating the danger we and our families face as unimportant. And 3, deliberately lying by claiming children are not infectious. In this context, the independent and international organization of teachers and workers in their workplaces is vital. The capitalist aristocracy is deliberately endangering the lives and health of millions. The way forward is for the working class to take control of the key social and economic resources and to use them rationally based on scientific knowledge to fight the pandemic. Workers cannot, however, rely on unions or the courts. They're facing not a national but a global pandemic. And France's parliament has already shamelessly voted in May an amnesty for all official violations of health law by government officials during the pandemic. France's General Confederation of Labor Union has co-signed with German unions its approval of this July's 750 billion euro European Union corporate bailout. Due to the collapse in their dues base since the 1970s, 90% of the French union's budgets come from business or public subsidies. Top union officials are eager to restart business and get a cut of the billions of euros that are passing through corporate offices and works councils. They're doing this at the expense of workers' lives. French education unions have therefore made no strike calls, though one smaller union initially proposed to delay school reopenings. This was just by 1 week. Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the French ally of Spain's Podemos government and of Corbyn, the Labour leader in Britain, suddenly said yesterday that he's, quote, a little worried about what he called the lack of preparation for a second wave. However, his party itself is implicated in this. It rushed this spring to issue calls for an end to the lockdown that is proven now disastrously premature. The existing institutions and relations in society are catastrophically failing working people, and a revolutionary and socialist response is required. This forum is a critical moment in the struggle by workers internationally to take action, organize themselves, get information, and fight to protect their safety against murderous state policies. The setting up of action committees by teachers in Britain, the United States, and across the world marks an important step to prepare for an international general strike action to bring down anti-worker governments around the world and to prepare for a true fight against the COVID pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, for your contribution. And I think it is important for our audience to be very aware of the situation that's developing throughout Europe, which you succinctly explained. And I think, you know, France is certainly one of the epicenters, and as is Spain. We have Alejandro Lopez, who is a supporter of the International Committee from Spain, and he will outline the situation there. And again, like I said, there is a very, very large increase in the cases, and there is opposition developing. I have read about the possibility of strike action amongst teachers and the closure of certain schools. So he will outline the impact of the pandemic there and what the measures that we're advocating. So Alejandro, can you unmute yourself and please take the floor? Thank you.
Thanks, Tanya. It's a great privilege to speak today at the Educators Rank and File Committee. The back to school policy implemented and overseen in Spain by the allies of Corbyn's Labour Party, the Socialist Party Podemos government with trade union support, has been catastrophic. It is reckless, criminal, and a conscious policy. As everyone knows, Spain was one of the hardest hit countries at the beginning of the year. In just 3 months, nearly 45,000 people died from COVID-19. Amid growing anger in the population and after workers went on strike in major industries in Italy, France, and Spain, the Spanish government decided to implement a nationwide lockdown. Horrific images emerged of elderly people abandoned and dead in retirement homes, and the Palacio del Hielo, Madrid's main ice skating rink, became a morgue. The ruling class, however, demanded Spain get back to business to what they call Save August. It wanted to save the tourism industry, which represents over 1/10 of Spain's GDP, to produce profits after billions of euros in the European Union bailouts were handed out to the banks and big corporations. At the end of June, Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez called the pandemic the new normal. Cases had gone down thanks to lockdowns. However, no preparations were made for a second wave, and it was widely expected. Spain is still short of 12,000 contact tracers, stocks of basic medicine against COVID-19, and it does not even have enough doctors and nurses, especially ICUs. I've just heard now that in Madrid's hospitals are already starting to be overflown. In July, the virus started rapidly resurging. Now Spain is again the epicenter of Europe. The country has had 659,000 cases, of which more than 122,000 have been reported only in the past 2 weeks. In the past week, there's also been 500 deaths. In this context, the Spanish government decided against all evidence that it was safe to open schools for 8 million students and 700,000 educators. Education Minister Isabel Celaá said, and I quote, "We have worked since the beginning to have a safe and controlled environment. Obviously, zero risk doesn't exist in any socializing arena, but the school, as it is now, is safer than other areas." This was a lie. Behind the scenes, officials were telling Celaá that back to school would be in quotes, chaotic. Celaá first met the regional education officials on August 27. That is 2 weeks before the school started reopening. Schools still had no instructions on how to open until a week before they actually opened. As not enough teachers have been hired to reduce class sizes to satisfy social distancing, the government is telling teachers to open classroom windows to increase ventilation. Last week, the Madrid region announced that 66,000 educators should undergo coronavirus antibody tests before schools started. Educators have less than 24 hours notice to get tested. This led to chaotic scenes as thousands queued in Madrid streets, with social distancing all but impossible. Over 2,000 of them tested positive. The return to school is politically criminal policy that will massively accelerate the resurgence of the virus. Madrid's right-wing regional premier, Isabel Ayuso, bluntly declared, I quote, "It is likely that practically all children, one way or another, will be infected with coronavirus." This is herd immunity policy, as other speakers have just spoken about. This is allowing the virus to spread without restraint. The Socialist Party and Podemos bear full responsibility for tens of thousands of infections in recent weeks, and for the wave of deaths that tragically are ensuing or will ensue. Educators are resisting. As corona outbreaks emerge in schools across Spain, COVID-19 has already closed at least 120 schools in Spain and over 500 classrooms. Every day, more classrooms are confined. These events highlight the international significance of today's meeting. As British teachers are meeting, opposition and resistance in Spain is mounting and around the world. Independent committees like this one are the only way forward for teachers to defend their health and lives, and those of their students and their families. The trade unions in Spain aim to suppress this growing resistance. Instead of unifying teachers, Spain's largest trade union, Comisiones Obreras, CCOO, has called 5 different strikes in 5 different regions and on different days. They want to let off steam that allows school reopenings to proceed. The unions, in fact, support the back to school policy. Isabel Galvin, CCOO General Secretary for Education, said, I quote, "We're mobilized because we want to go back to school and remain there. We're working hard so all industries can return to work, so we must commit ourselves to face-to-face classes. Children need to go back to school for their education and emotional stability." To conclude, it is critical for workers and youth across Europe to set up their own action committees, independent of the unions, and link them up to developing international movement again among workers and teachers. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. That was a very powerful contribution. I mean, what an extraordinary situation. 500 deaths per week in Spain, and they've decided to reopen schools and universities under such conditions. This is malign neglect, and this is what's confronting workers throughout Europe as a whole. And it's clear, as you point out, that there is growing resistance to this amongst educators and more broadly the working class as a whole. We have a couple of more people who have put their names down to speak. We'll take them if you can keep your comments brief so we can have as many others, and then we'll continue with other discussions. I know there are some students who want to participate in this discussion, so we'd like to make sure that they have the opportunity to speak and take further questions. Sent a message to everyone. If you do want to contribute, just raise your hand or leave a message in the chat. I think, Vicky, you wanted to make a point perhaps or answer a question, I'm not sure. And then Harvey, you also wanted to make a point following her. So if you unmute, Vicky.
Yeah, I just wonder whether you have any information about the number of teachers that have caught the virus, or the number of schools that have closing down. You know, whether there is any data that is able to inform teachers and parents and pupils of exactly what is taking place around the country in terms of specific, you know, data. So.
Thanks, Vicky. There isn't any specific data, and that's one of the criminal elements of this, is that there is no national data being kept or recorded by either the government or the unions who are in a position to gather all of this data. They've got people on the floor in every school really, but there isn't. But what data there is like I said, we know that there are 25,000 teachers being forced to isolate, of which many of those will have either symptoms, but we can't establish exactly how many have actually got the virus itself. And in terms of closures, what we can say, I mean, again, it's not recorded, what we can say is that whole school closures are virtually non-existent. Regardless of the levels of infection and how many, they are not closing schools. The policy should be that I think it's 3 infections that are across bubbles would necessitate the school closing, and the very least for deep cleaning, and then those 3 bubbles isolating. That's the policy at the moment, but there are hardly any schools that are fully closed, and there have been examples of bubbles closing, but that's being resisted now. The government has come forward to say, oh, look, this isn't what we meant. We didn't mean just because somebody in a bubble of 240 has got the virus that you actually have to shut the entire bubble, and so on and so forth. So they're constantly backtracking because of the disaster and because schools are not managing on what their own advice has been. So you do have instances where, like I said, it's impossible to say, but you know, just a couple of people who have been you know, sent home, to a class that's been sent home, to people being asked to, I mean, like with the staff, you know, you're being asked, have you spent more than 15 minutes talking face to face with somebody? Because if you haven't, you're not going home. I mean, it's just extraordinary how it's all being interpreted. But I just received something which I'm just trying to find now from Tori Bibbs, who does actually have the who is following this, and they say we now know that 1,305 UK schools have been infected with coronavirus. They say the real figure is probably double that because some areas don't report. Manchester's got 170 schools impacted, Northern Ireland 97. The large London councils in particular are concealing their infections because there's a whole thing about, well, what's happening in London and so forth. I mean, the testing is taking place almost exclusively in the north because of the local lockdowns. Very little testing taking place in the south, which is the most populous part of the United Kingdom. So it is impossible to really follow the level of infection within schools itself, but we certainly know that the R rate is going up, that the infections across daily being official infections, and we've just noticed that there are 38,000 which hasn't been reported. So it is impossible to tell because they are suppressing this information because they know how powerful it will be, because they've told everyone it's safe to open schools, and then within 2 weeks you've got what they are saying is 38,000 infections, and that is being fueled by the reopening of schools. So they can't have this information readily available for anybody, either in the workplace or families and so forth. Harvey, did you have a question or did you want to make a point?
I just wanted to reiterate a brief point, if I could. Thank you for letting me speak again. As the speakers have made clear again today, and the very existence of the rank and file safety committees testifies, I think it's been shown that no serious addressing of the deadly spread of COVID-19, nor any of the other burning social issues will take place outside of the independent action of the workers themselves. As I tried to convey in my last contribution at the last rank and file committee meeting, in an example from the school where I work, and is no doubt replicated across the entire school system, the workers themselves had to argue for face visors, for example, in order to protect themselves with the school management. And when they faced equivocation, they had to purchase them themselves to protect themselves and their colleagues. And I think, just to conclude with such is the seriousness of the situation now with the World Socialist website makes this clear today in the article that 13 million people on Tuesday will be in some form of lockdown. That's a fifth of the population of the entire country. And Johnson's made clear that there won't be a national lockdown that will in any way endanger the profits of the corporations. And schools themselves, as he has explicitly said, will stay open throughout. And I think this just provides the the biggest argument really for the development of the network of such rank and file committees that have been set up in every sphere, every industry and every sphere of society.
Okay, thank you, Harvey. At this point, I'd like to ask Danny Knightley, if I can call you to speak. Danny's a university student who's recently published an article on the World Socialist website on the impact of the return to students to campus, and he'll outline some of the issues confronting students who return from next week. Danny, if you can unmute, that would be helpful. Thank you. Your turn.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Cool, perfect. Good afternoon to you all. Thank you for having me on here. As Tanya said, I am a current final year university student and a representative of the International Youth and Students for Social Equality. Myself and hundreds of thousands of other students are set to return to universities from Monday, just as COVID-19 is spreading rapidly once again. Even as restrictions were reintroduced this week, limiting private gatherings to just 6 people, after months of the drive by both Conservative and Labour parties to reopen the economy and get people back to work, even as the virus spreads. There has been a 43% increase in infections this week alone, driven by a huge spike in cases amongst 17 to 29-year-olds, the same group that will be returning to campuses. The rate of infection amongst this age group is now more than double the national average and rising. While many universities consider the possibility of transitioning entirely to online learning for this first term, most have committed to at least some face-to-face contact, including my university, on the grounds that campus living is, quote-unquote, a key part of the university experience for many. But I would argue that a key part of the university experience is surviving it, not passing on an aggressive virus onto one's friends and loved ones. At my university, we have been informed that everyone is expected to return. And if they do not, students are still expected to pay the same inflated fees of over £9,000 a year for online learning and limited access to resources. Some of my friends who are foreign students and have vulnerable relatives at home have chosen not to return, and they will have to pay £21,000 a year to attend uni, even though they've decided not to return. More and more students are struggling to support themselves, with 1 in 5 unable to pay their rent. Additionally, many universities are seeing up to an increase of 190% in applications for hardship funds. And just regarding people's points about transparency information, my university students have been left completely in the dark as to how teaching will be conducted, with mixed messages about in-person and online learning being randomly dispatched throughout the summer, often contradicting each other with no clear plan in place. For my accommodation, we all have to return on the same day, with no attempt to stagger the arrivals across a broader period of time to ensure there is as minimal contact as possible with arriving students. In the space of a week, I and many thousands of others will be going from a clearly defined bubble of family and friends to mixing with hundreds of others, including shared kitchen spaces and toilet facilities, hotspots for virus transmission. To add insult to injury, my generation, that is expected to return to colleges and universities is being blamed by the government and media for spreading COVID-19, with recently Health Secretary Matt Hancock urging young people not to kill their grandparents. However, blaming young people for the spread of the virus is a blatant attempt to conceal the real policy of the Johnson government, Labour Party, Liberal Democrats, and all the media is to allow the virus to spread, so-called herd immunity. This eugenic-style aim, combined with systemic greed and corruption, has caused tens of thousands of deaths. Rather than establishing mass testing to ensure that campuses are COVID safe, the government has announced that testing will be restricted to essential workers due to shortages. 6 months on the testing system has been highly inadequate, with those unable to get tests or being told to travel hundreds of miles to receive one. The testing system's current collapse is due to the reopening of schools, as has been said, with infection spreading among teachers and pupils. However, the reopening of universities will only make it worse, with students having a greater degree of autonomy and freedom of movement. Regarding the unions, the University and College Union, UCU, has said that the return of students was a recipe for disaster, yet no call has been made to mobilise members against it. No statement has yet been made by Labour leader Keir Starmer or the National Union of Students in response to the murderous drive of the Johnson government to get students back to university and paying their fees. However, there is still widespread opposition among students and teachers who have raised concerns over the testing policies and alternate learning styles advanced by universities, with numerous petitions and protests demanding a return to online learning. This opposition is echoed internationally, as has been said by Evan Blake, with graduate students at the University of Michigan taking strike action. It is urgent that students and educators take matters in their own hands and place no trust in the government, fake opposition parties, or the university institutions. Campus safety committees must be built to ensure appropriate safety procedures are put in place to protect the health of students and staff and fight for an increased testing on campuses. The International Youth and Students for Social Equality, the student and youth movement of the Socialist Equality Party, is committed to opposing these conditions. We demand that the return of students to university is postponed until effective testing measures are put in place to reduce the risk of transmission among the student population and university staff. We demand an end to tuition fees, the full refund of fees already paid out for this year's tuition, state funding of higher education for all as a right, the cancelling of student debt, and the reintroduction of a living grant to cover accommodation and other essential expenses. These demands cannot be met while we as students and educators continue to fight for our rights within student and teachers' unions and within our own university institutions who are committed to maintaining the status quo. Students and teachers across the country must establish their own independent safety committees to ensure safe working and studying conditions. The fight to defend health and safety against the unsafe reopening of schools, workplaces and universities requires a mobilisation of the working class against the Tory government, its Labour allies and the capitalist system as a whole. I urge all listening to form their own committees in their local areas, read the WSWS for updates on the wider international struggle, and join the SCP to help carry forward this fight. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Danny. That was an excellent contribution, and as you say, this is going to escalate the situation in the next days and the context in which it takes place. And we will be campaigning amongst students for such a unified perspective. Are there any others who we have some further time for discussion before we call on any other contributors from the floor? Would anyone like to ask any questions or speak on their situation at work? It would be really helpful to have as broad a based discussion as possible. I can't see anyone on my list at the moment. I don't think there is. There was somebody, but then changed their mind. Are there any other contributions at all? I can't see any here. Unless I'm looking at the wrong screen.
Nick.
Yeah, Nick is the one who I think has changed his mind. I just got a message saying he doesn't want to speak now. But if you do want to speak, unmute yourself. But if you've changed your mind, that's fine. Yeah.
Alex would like to speak on the red pen question, Tanya.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alex.
Yes, comrades, I think someone wrote into the meeting to ask how the red pens are doing and if they're having success. For anyone who isn't familiar with them, this is a group of now approximately, it's a Facebook group with approximately 70,000 members that was set up shortly by teachers shortly after the beginning of the Yellow Vest movement in France. So the Yellow Vest began in November of 2018. Those were the first protests, and the Red Pens Facebook groups were set up, sort of copying what drivers and sort of what were sort of initially more sort of rural layers of workers in France were setting up the Yellow Vest Facebook pages, and the teachers by analogy set up this Red Pen group, which has grown and continues to grow, and workers and teachers especially send information. They have useful tools like the school tracking app that workers and parents especially can consult to see what is happening and try to get information that's denied to them by the French government. And I think at the PES, we have been very sympathetic to this organization. I think it's very important, and when we intervene in among the Red Pens, I think it's very important to distinguish between just the sort of the discussions that take place between teachers on Facebook and the many different issues and points of view that are expressed on the Red Pens Facebook group, and a decision that's being taken by educators and other sections of workers and here in Britain, in France, and internationally to organize and to decide to take action politically and to enter into a political struggle with the government, and to insist that struggle, not only that they don't trust the trade unions anymore, which is very broadly felt, but that if the trade unions and the Labour Party and La France Insoumise or the Nouveau Parti Anticapitaliste here are no longer trusted, then there has to be a political fight, that opposition has to be organized, that and that there has to be a struggle for socialism and against capitalism, and an independent perspective and an internationalist perspective for the working class. These questions are questions that we fight to bring into the Red Pens, that and that we are obviously encouraging teachers and other workers who are attending this event to fight to bring into their communities and also to their co-workers in the workplaces. And I think the red pens have been a success. They're a first step, but we have to take the situation with the pandemic very seriously. Independent forms of struggle, independent organizations of struggle, and a socialist perspective are required. And I think we're all here to make this known and to launch this more militant and active movement in the international working class and a struggle for socialist consciousness. So I think this is these are the points I would make on the red pens.
Thanks very much, Alex. I mean, I think similar issues and organisations and groups have been formed within Britain in which we've fought to intervene. And if you read them, there's a whole layer who are advocating amongst these discussions for more militant action, saying why aren't the unions organising strikes? Why isn't there walkouts being organised? This is, you know, this must take place in order to stop this because no one is listening to us, no one is in the government, and so forth. And I think, and you know, we intervene in order to clarify these questions. But I know, Tom, you are going to tackle some of these issues that have come up in our discussions with teachers and these forums, in particular in relationship to the role of the unions and why they haven't taken up a fight and precisely what they have actually been doing throughout this pandemic. Tom, would you like to speak now?
Yes, I can speak now. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, just want to sort of put in context really. I'm a secondary school teacher, and I think in the last 2 weeks it's been incredibly, just incredibly hard, as Tanya said, as mentioned, about how teachers and educators have been treated and have been sent back into schools which are unsafe, totally put it. I have, you know, I'm very hard to actually catch members of staff to talk to people because we are so just moving around the schools in zones with different bubbles of kids and teaching across classrooms, which we wouldn't teach in normally. And the conditions are just, you know, tiring. They're unsustainable for teachers to continue to do throughout the pandemic. And this has been, you know, this has been allowed to happen by the representation that teachers turn to in some respects, which are the unions. But I think that as you look over the course of the last 2 weeks, there are numbers of absences going up. We're not told if a kid has been sent home because of COVID-related illnesses. The first thing we understand has happened in our school is the fact you see on the register there's an X, which means it's been sent home, but we're not told who those kids are and what is happening next. So the information, again, is something that is so important to be sharing with everybody, and the transparency is just not happening in schools. And I just wanted to go into a bit more in detail about the role of the unions and the teacher unions in the UK and their role and how they've actually played the game of the course of the pandemic. And I think one of the things to start off with, for example, is there are many unions, for example, in the UK, and in terms of the context of this, there are larger ones, and the largest one that really has the most influence is the National Education Union, which amalgamated with the ATL about a couple of years ago. It became the largest teaching union in Europe, so it has nearly 500,000 members. That's 500,000 members that they have failed to even, you know, organise or even push forward for any strike action against the actual criminal role of the nature of reopening the schools. They are responsible for abandoning their members to the government's policy of herd immunity. And you know, just to say about their record, I went through and actually had created a timeline of what they had done over the course of the pandemic. And I mean, from the very start, as schools struggled to keep open their schools, there was no call for schools to close. There was assistance of keeping schools open, for example. The NEU Joint Secretary, Mary Boosted, who's been complicit in across that time period, has very clearly endorsed the government's assistance. She said schools are, a quote from what she said in the first instance, and this was back in March and 16th. The government's insistence on keeping schools open, they are a major public service for children on free school meals. They are a place where children get fed. Having our child at school allows parents to work. So straight away, there was that clear insistence that the schools aren't for education purposes. It is actually allowing the economy to continue and make profit. You also have the fact that there was no call to protect members at the start. Members were being kind of anxious about the situation. People were very vulnerable, were ringing in and saying they didn't want to go to school and go to work. And this eventually, under huge pressure, schools were closed. Now, over the course of the period, on April the 14th, where there was huge amounts of cases that are arising across the UK, the NEU launched a petition. And this was a petition, online petition that calls for schools to remain closed to wider pupil intake until safe. Now, this was signed by teachers, parents, doctors, and it reached at its peak when it was eventually taken down, about 500,000 signatures. So back in April, they had this huge surge of support that still remains, that was not mobilized, that was not actually put into action to even sort of think about a reaction to this situation. And what we did eventually, on the 1st of May, they released this 5-point criteria that basically mentioned the fact of various tests that would actually be put in place when schools would return. So, for example, one of the tests was actually lower case of COVID, and this obviously, as schools started to open September, the cases started to go up. We now have over 4,000 cases that were reported at the end of this week, and these cases were really about social distancing, testing. All these cases have not been covered. I mean, it's not worth the paper it was written on. And over the course of the next months after that 1st of May announcement, they basically, every single statement they released said we would work with the government. I mean, through the whole period, they've been putting forward the actual view. They will work with the government. They'll work with Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary. So a couple of quotes here. For example, they praised Gavin Williamson's statement for his door is open, discussion of the union. We've got the idea here as well. We talked about the fact that the only opposition really came when a number of scientific science advisors broke with SAGE as well. And for example, they called for after that they called for a national COVID-19 educational task force with government, unions, educational stakeholders to agree statutory guidance for safe reopening schools. And this continued. It continued throughout this period, and eventually you have a change in their rhetoric, and you have before that. In fact, I'm just going back a little bit. I'm just going to look at the date here. 1st of June, around this period, they wrote to the Prime Minister pleading. And this is a quote from their letter: "We would be very pleased to meet with you and with your Secretary of State of Education discuss the 10-point plan." And a 10-point plan they released was a watered down version of the 5 tests. It wasn't even a way of protecting their members or staff and workers in school. And this continued. That letter sent the 10th of June was never replied to. And I'm going to come back to that letter in a moment. Now, as we get further into the actual school opening, the NEU put it forward its idea to the government and say has to be able to convince, this is a quote, convince school staff that sufficient measures are in place to make it COVID secure for them to work in a class of 30 or more children, which is mostly the case across secondary schools. for them to work in a class of 30 or more children with neither social distancing nor PPE, personal protective equipment, and often with poor ventilation. As Tanya has mentioned, that is the case. You know, the whole charm offensive, the fact that the government put forward an offensive to try and convince parents and educators it was safe to return, was a complete and utter propaganda campaign that basically covered over cracks in funding, cracks in organisation of schools over decades. Now, as a result of that, we now have obviously members, all teachers back in school. And one of the things to think about in this respect is that as we move further towards the actual opening of schools, there was debate about face masks, which came in the same instance as then reiterate a 10-point programme. And as Kevin mentioned in his contribution in the meeting, the fact that members were sent an email after a betrayal and each response from the union. And the email said, it's an insulting email. It was titled, "We have your back." As we were thrown back into schools, we have your back. And there was a reaction from this. The fact that you had on social media, for example, and ultimately what happened towards the end is that the latest email that members got was ultimately a reiteration after 2 weeks of being back at school, after cases rising. The last pick we have was a email saying, "We wrote to Prime Minister back in June, he hasn't responded to us, we're rewriting again." And that is the actual role of the unions. Thank you.
Sorry, where am I? Thank you, Tom. We're coming towards the conclusion of the meeting. We have two other speakers who wanted to contribute in the discussion. Simon Whelan, who is a university lecturer, and perhaps wanted to add some points on how this reopening of schools and campuses impacts on lecturers. So Simon, did you want to make a brief contribution on that?
Please, Tanya. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Great. Greetings, friends, colleagues and comrades. I'll keep my remarks relatively brief. The college, further education and higher education establishments are being reopened this week and next week. We'll be witnessing this weekend, especially, the movement of hundreds of thousands of young people across the country to new locations to start or continue their studies. And I think we must make this very clear that this is a very dangerous situation. A word on semantics just to begin with. As a former electrician, I think I'd like to just take issue with the whole government's circuit breakers, quite frankly. A circuit breaker breaks the circuit. It prevents electricity from being conducted. The arbitrary measures being taken by the government, the groups of 6, bars closing at 10, provisional, limited, regional lockdowns are not going to break the circuit. These are arbitrary, pseudo-scientific measures that are going to be exacerbated by the frankly nonsensical measures that are being brought about for the new term within universities and colleges. On the one hand, students are being told that they cannot mix outside of these groups of 6, and yet they are being encouraged as part of their learning to attend face-to-face classes in college, especially for medical and veterinary courses. Face-to-face teaching is going to occur, whilst students and staff are being warned. Are being told that these will be small groups in large classes. The very fact that these classes will be small means there will be more of them. and there simply are not enough lecture theatres, i.e. bigger classrooms, within any university, the former polytechnics or the Red Brick Russell Group, means that not only during face-to-face teaching will health and safety of students and staff be endangered, but in their movements around the college, in their accommodation, many students, a point that's not been made, I've not seen this anywhere, many students are actually also key workers. They work in supermarkets, they work in the kind of businesses that were deemed vital during the shutdown. I noticed one of the early contributors, Danny, mentioned there's been some of the context to this return to higher education. There's a 43% increase in infections alone, driven by a spike among 17 to 29-year-olds, exactly the kind of demographic attending university over recent days. And the rate of infection amongst this age group is now more than double the national average and rising. There's also, of course, the dangers that many younger people are asymptomatic in that sense, which makes testing, tracing, tracking impossible, basically. In midweek, the Prime Minister acknowledged what we now, sorry, I'm quoting Johnson, and what we are now seeing is unfortunately the progression of the disease from younger groups, who he said everybody knows are much less prone to its worst effects, up to older groups. So we're speaking here not just in defence of students, but also of university staff who are going to come into contact with other people in the university, but staff, and also, although their numbers are much smaller these days, mature students. So we have a whole series, a whole number of arbitrary and contradictory measures being taken both within the universities and in public that are not going to prevent the spread of the pandemic. In fact, what we're creating here is universities as incubators for the virus. And it's also slightly misleading to speak of a second wave. This is not like the flu. What we're witnessing is the pandemic, is the virus. There isn't a second wave as such. This is the virus. This is the continuation, to use that term. This is the first wave, quite frankly. Now, the UCU, the Union of College and Union Workers, have issued a series of mealy-mouthed statements, but essentially they're leaving it up to individual staff to complain to their individual universities. This week I received an email from Joe Grady, the leader of the UCU, offering a series of pro forma letters, all of them written from the perspective of identity politics. All the pro forma letters are speaking as a BAME member of staff, a female member of staff. This is how we're meant to protest this, murderous return to work with letters of individual complaint, which of course, coming as individuals, will lead us to potential victimization by the universities. So under these kind of conditions, it's absolutely imperative, the importance of the rank and file safety committees, their formation in all workplaces, in all universities, colleges and schools, becomes an issue of paramount importance. Workers cannot rely on the Labour Party. I think it's already been mentioned, Starmer is Johnson's partner in this return to work. They offer, together with the unions, absolutely no opposition. It is up to the workforce, it is up to the workers, together with students, because the NUS is offering absolutely nothing in opposition to these moves, these murderous moves back to campus. It's up to the workers to take action and organise themselves into these rank and file committees. There is only a political response and a political solution to this pandemic. The scientists and the medical fraternity will do their work. But first and foremost, this is a political issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. We're going to be closing the meeting in about 10 minutes. We have one more contribution and then we'll make a summary of the discussion and what the next steps are. Stephen is a student who is starting this year and has just completed his A-level, which has obviously been an utter catastrophe for tens and thousands of A-level students this past year. And he wanted to make a few points on that experience and how he feels about going to university. Stephen, do you want to unmute and make a few comments?
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, thank you.
Okay, hi, my name is Stephen Hunter. I'm from Sheffield, and as of October, I'm supposed to be moving down to London to study at Imperial College. A lot of what I'm going to say will probably echo a lot of what Danny said earlier, but I'm going to try and come at it from a different angle by talking about my experiences as a student who has just finished A-levels and is preparing to start my first year at university. For students like myself, our experience of the government's handling of this pandemic and its impact on our education can be characterized as insincere and reckless. The premature reopening of schools and universities disregarded the judgment and safety of teachers and students alike and removed all control of the situation from those most qualified to properly direct it. All of these government decisions have been sold to the public with the lie that students missing out on any more education is the biggest threat to their futures, not the deadly disease they will be spreading to their friends and family. The forceful reopening of schools was naturally met by criticism and opposition from many groups of people more qualified to make the decisions than Boris Johnson. Members of the scientific community who have actually studied viruses and epidemics, teachers who understand the value of learning better than any others, and of course students who knew that they would not be safe to return to schools surrounded by hundreds of other people. Their collective consensus was that reopening classrooms was ill-timed, unnecessary, and would lead to the deaths of many more people. Now, those fears have actualized as a daily increase in the number of new cases in the UK. Young people were faced with the stark realization that the government valued getting things back to normal and getting the economy back again was more important than their lives. And as part of getting things back to normal, the government needed to award students with grades. As a student who has just finished their A-levels, I can remember clearly how me and many other working class students felt reading about the standardization algorithm for the first time. It stated in black and white that the government did not care about our teachers' judgments based on talent, work ethic, perseverance, and evidence, but that it would be the backgrounds we came from which would be the deciding factor in what grades we should get. The government made the terrible mistake of exposing its contempt for the working class to working class students who had just spent several years laboriously studying under conditions of high stress to compete against private schools for university places, and we were not going to accept less than we deserved. When A-level results day came, the algorithm served to pull up the number of A's and A stars obtained by private schools by 4.7%, and in Scotland's most deprived areas, the proportion of students receiving A to C grades reduced by 15.2%. This was met by the outbreak of organised student-run demonstrations protesting the blatant classism with signs stating, "Judge my schoolwork, not my income." The unexpected organised opposition and the fear that the situation would explode on GCSE results day, just weeks before they planned to force students and teachers back into unsafe schools, filled the government with fear of further refusal to comply. So they announced a U-turn on the biased standardisation of grades, not out of regret for their attack on the opportunities of working class students, but to subside any further opposition to their forceful reopening of schools and universities. Finally, the government had the audacity to blame younger people for the recent rise in coronavirus cases, but it was the government's decision to force them back into work in bars and restaurants. It was the government's decision to incentivise people to return to eating in those bars and restaurants, and now it is the government's decision that young people returning to universities is more important than protecting lives. Young people have absolutely no say in the making of these decisions which endangers their lives. But if there is something I've learned from my experience through the A-level situation, it is that students can and must take back control of the terms on which their education proceeds. Students and educators must organise to oppose the return to university and unnecessary face-to-face teaching until a time when all feel appropriate measures have been taken to keep them safe. This is the decision of students and educators to make, not Boris Johnson. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. We're going to conclude. We have 5 minutes left before the end of the meeting. I first want to thank our international panelists, Evan, Alejandro, and Alex, for participating in this discussion. Their contributions are invaluable, and I do think they make very clear the international character of this crisis, the commonality of the issues that are confronting workers, and the development of the opposition that's being expressed in country after country, and as has been said, finds no organised expression, and the intervention of our party, which is gaining support amongst broader and broader sections. I also want to thank all those who have participated, those in particular education industry who have made a contribution on how this is impacting their workplace, their colleagues, and so forth. So that's been very, very important, and again, very similar issues that have been pointed out. Before we conclude, I want to make a very direct appeal for all of those in the education industry to join the Rank and File Committee, to participate in its work. The information on the next meeting is on your screen now. We will have one in a week's time, next Saturday, on the 26th of the 9th. You can register from now onwards before you leave as well, so that we can continue this discussion and develop strategies and methods in which we can expand its work. So I call you to do that. I also urge you all to read the WSWS. There has been an extraordinary amount of articles being published on education itself. Sorry, I didn't have my camera on education, and just this week alone on what's happening in the universities, the schools, the rising of infections, what's taking place in Europe, what's taking place in the United States. It is an invaluable source for educating and understanding the conditions that are confronting the working class globally, both in terms of education and more broadly. So I urge you to look at that, wsws.org. But before you leave, please make the decision to join this committee, to participate in its work, and to engage, sorry, I'm reading messages at the time, to participate in its work, to sign up for its newsletter, registration, and the next meeting on next Saturday. So thank you very much for your participation, and hopefully we will see you all next week. Thank you. Is it finished?